My name is Rebecca. I am 33 years old and the CEO of a cybersecurity firm I built from the ground up. If you asked my family, they would tell you I just sell little computer programs while my brother is the real tech genius. Last Christmas, my brother stood in my parents' dining room, waving a $200 glass of scotch, and told our entire extended family that I could not handle a real career in the IT industry. He smiled when he said it. He wanted to embarrass me in front of everyone, but he stopped smiling when my grandmother took a sip of her tea and asked him a simple question that completely destroyed his life. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to watch an arrogant family member get exactly what they deserve. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Chicago meant keeping up appearances was more important than actual affection. Our house was massive and pristine but emotionally barren. I was always the afterthought while my older brother Jason was the undeniable golden child. My parents, Richard and Susan, praised his every breath. They even drained my college fund to give him the seed money for his tech startup Summit Tech. Meanwhile, I paid my own way through school and founded Aegis Cyber, quietly building an empire while they praised his hollow achievements. The dining room of my parents' house was suffocating that Christmas night. The long mahogany table was crowded with aunts, uncles, and cousins. The crystal chandeliers reflected off the fine china. Jason was holding court at the head of the table right next to my father. His wife Kendra sat beside him dripping in diamonds and wearing a designer dress she bought with company funds. She was his chief financial officer, and the two of them loved to project an image of extreme wealth and superiority. I sat quietly at the opposite end of the table near my 82-year-old grandmother Ruth. Jason had been taking passive-aggressive shots at me since the appetizers. By the time the main course was served, he decided to go for the kill. He stood up, tapping his silver fork against his crystal glass to command the room. He smoothed his tailored suit jacket and looked right at me with a condescending smirk. "Not everyone can handle a real career in IT," he announced, his voice booming over the soft holiday music playing in the background. "Managing physical servers for thousands of corporate clients is a lot different than writing your little antivirus software, Rebecca. You should really come tour my facility sometime and see how the big leagues operate. Maybe I could even give you a job in our help desk department if your little startup ever goes under." My parents chuckled warmly. My mother, Susan, patted his arm, looking at him with absolute adoration. Kendra let out a high-pitched theatrical laugh and took a delicate sip of her wine. The extended family murmured in polite agreement, totally buying into his illusion of grandeur. I did not react. I did not frown or look down at my plate. I simply met his gaze and smiled a cold, calculated smile. I had been waiting for this exact moment for months. Before I could even open my mouth to deliver the blow, my grandmother Ruth shifted in her antique wooden chair. She set her floral porcelain teacup down on its matching saucer with a sharp clink that echoed through the sudden quiet of the room. She looked up at Jason, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses. "Is that why her company just bought yours?" she asked. Her voice was steady and clear, cutting through the festive atmosphere like a sharpened blade. You could hear a pin drop in that massive dining room. The silence was heavy and absolute, weighing down on everyone present. The arrogant smirk vanished from Jason's face in an instant, replaced by a pale, sickening mask of pure confusion and absolute terror. His hand began to shake so violently that the expensive scotch splashed over the rim of his crystal glass and stained the pristine white tablecloth underneath. Kendra froze completely, with her expensive red wine glass suspended halfway to her mouth, her eyes widening in absolute horror as the color rapidly drained from her normally vibrant face. My father stopped chewing his roast beef, staring blankly. My mother let out a small, confused gasp, dropping her fork. No one moved or breathed. The golden child had just been publicly stripped of his fake crown, and the entire extended family was completely paralyzed by the sudden, crushing shock of the absolute truth. The suffocating silence held for what felt like an eternity before my mother Susan finally snapped. She slammed her hands down on the table, rattling the silverware, and glared at me with absolute fury. "What on earth is wrong with you, Rebecca?" she shrieked, her voice trembling with indignation. "How dare you ruin our family holiday with such a vicious and disgusting lie? You have always been jealous of your brother, but making up a story like this on Christmas is a new low even for you." My father, Richard, immediately joined the attack, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. He pointed a thick, accusing finger at me across the table. "You are going to apologize to Jason right now," he demanded, his voice echoing off the dining room walls. "You will apologize to him and to Kendra for trying to humiliate them in front of this family. Jason has built a legitimate enterprise from the ground up while you hide behind your little computer screens. Do you have any idea the kind of stress he is under? He does not need his own sister playing these pathetic childish games." I leaned back in my chair, completely unbothered by their predictable outrage. I did not yell back. I did not try to defend myself against their baseless accusations. I just watched them carefully, observing how quickly they rallied to protect their golden child. Jason finally found his voice, though it was noticeably weaker than it had been 5 minutes ago. He let out a forced, hollow laugh and looked around at the extended family, trying to regain control of the narrative. "Do not worry about it, Mom," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "She is just trying to get a rise out of us. My company is currently valued at $8 million. There is absolutely no way her little security startup could ever afford to buy me out. It is mathematically impossible." Kendra quickly nodded, her diamond earrings flashing in the chandelier light. "Exactly," she chimed in, her voice dripping with venom. "Summit Tech is an industry leader. We just signed 2 major vendor contracts last month. Rebecca is just desperate for attention because she has no one to share the holidays with." Their arrogance was almost comical, considering they were standing on a trap door I had already pulled the lever on. I reached down beside my chair and picked up my leather briefcase. I set it on my lap, unclasped the brass lock, and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. I placed the folder on the table and gave it a firm push, sliding it straight across the white linen right past the roasted turkey and the cranberry sauce until it stopped directly in front of Jason's plate. "Go ahead and prove me wrong then, Jason," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Open it. Read the first page aloud to the entire table. Show everyone how mathematically impossible it is." Jason stared at the folder as if it were a live explosive. He looked at Kendra, who was now biting her lip nervously. He looked at my parents, who were still fuming, but suddenly unsure of themselves. Finally, with a trembling hand, he reached out and flipped open the heavy cover. His eyes darted across the top of the document. I watched his throat work as he swallowed hard. "Read it," I commanded, leaning forward slightly. "Read the header." Jason opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His face was entirely devoid of color now. "Read it, Jason," my father urged him, sounding a little less confident. "Just read what her ridiculous fake paper says, so we can put an end to this nonsense." Jason's voice cracked when he finally spoke. "Notice of final asset liquidation and transfer of corporate ownership." He read, his voice barely above a whisper. He paused, taking a ragged breath. "Effective as of December 24th. Summit Tech LLC, including all physical assets, intellectual property, and client contracts, is hereby transferred in its entirety to Aegis Cyber Incorporated." The dining room plunged into chaos once again. Kendra snatched the paper from his hands, her eyes scanning the legal jargon, desperately searching for a loophole that did not exist. My mother covered her mouth, letting out a muffled sob. My father stood up so quickly his chair tipped over, crashing onto the hardwood floor. "This is a forgery," my father shouted, slamming his fist. "You forged this to scare him." "It is a legally binding contract signed by his majority creditors," I replied calmly. "He defaulted on his venture capital loans 6 months ago. I bought his debt and executed the hostile takeover yesterday morning. It is not a rumor. I own him and his company. This conversation is over. Jason scrambled to pick up the pieces of his shattered ego. He forced another laugh, though this one sounded more like a dying engine than a display of confidence. He looked frantically at our parents, trying to re-establish the illusion he had spent years crafting. "You are being dramatic, Rebecca," he stammered while adjusting his tie. "It is just corporate jargon, Mom." "Dad, please listen to me. It is a strategic merger. We are simply combining our resources. Aegis Cyber desperately needs the Summit Tech infrastructure to scale their operations. We are partnering up as equals to dominate the regional tech market." She is just using legal terminology because she likes to sound tough in front of the family. I did not even blink. A merger implies two successful and solvent companies joining forces for mutual benefit. "Jason?" I corrected him, my tone dropping a few degrees. "A hostile asset liquidation means your company was bleeding out on the operating table, and I stepped in to buy the corpse for spare parts. You are not my partner in this transaction. You do not have a seat on my board of directors. You do not hold any equity in the new structure. I bought your physical servers to strip them down for hardware, and I bought your client list because your desperate clients were begging the industry for a competent security provider." Kendra slammed her hands onto the dining table, knocking over her crystal water glass. "You are lying!" she shrieked, her elegance dissolving into panic. "Summit is absolutely thriving. We just expanded our downtown office space last month." I turned my gaze to my sister-in-law. "You mean the downtown office you are currently being evicted from?" I asked, raising a single eyebrow. I reached into my leather briefcase one more time and pulled out a stack of papers, tossing them next to the takeover documents. "Let us talk about thriving, Kendra. According to the forensic audit I ordered last week, your thriving company is $4 million in debt. You have defaulted on 3 venture capital loans. You have several pending tax liens. You have not paid your vendor invoices since August. And worst of all, you have not made payroll in 2 months. Your employees are facing the holidays with zero income, trying to figure out how to feed their families, while you are sitting here wearing a $12,000 Cartier watch bought with company credit." The extended family gasped. Extended family. Aunts and uncles began whispering furiously to one another, pointing fingers and exchanging shocked glances. The facade of the successful tech visionary was disintegrating before their very eyes, turning into a pathetic display of fraud. Jason looked like he was going to be sick right there over the holiday roast. My parents stared at the financial documents scattered across the table, their expressions morphing from shock to sheer panic. But instead of turning their anger toward the son who had lied to them and stolen from his employees, they instinctively turned their irrational wrath right back onto me. "If you knew he was struggling so much, why did you not just help him out?" my mother demanded with tears streaming down her face. "You have millions of dollars in personal wealth, Rebecca. You have security contracts with federal agencies. You could have easily written a check to clear his debt without even blinking an eye. Instead, you wait until Christmas dinner to humiliate your own flesh and blood and steal his life work." My father pounded his fist onto the table, making the wine glasses rattle. "Your mother is right," he bellowed, his face turning a shade of purple. "This is your own brother. Family protects family no matter what. You have a moral duty to bail him out of this setback. You are going to call your lawyers first thing on Monday morning and reverse this entire process immediately. You will clear that $4 million debt from your own accounts, and you will return ownership of Summit Tech back to Jason where it belongs." I stared at my father, marveling at the depths of his delusion. "A moral duty," I repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the tense air. "Did he have a moral duty when he took the $200,000 you drained from my college fund to start this failed company? He squandered my education money on bad investments and luxury car leases while I worked 2 minimum wage jobs just to pay my state college tuition. I owe him absolutely nothing at all." "He is your blood," my father roared, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "He made a few minor business mistakes, but he is a visionary. You will fix this, Rebecca, or I will disown you tonight. I looked at my father as his threat hung in the air. Disown me? I asked, keeping my voice level. You cannot disown someone who has not relied on you for over a decade. Keep your empty threats. That was when Kendra finally snapped. The reality had clearly bypassed her husband and my parents, but it hit her right in the chest. As chief financial officer, she knew exactly what hostile asset liquidation meant for her personal bank accounts. She stood up so violently that her wooden chair scraped harshly against the hardwood floor. She slammed her manicured hands onto the table, leaning toward me with a look of pure hatred. You are a miserable, bitter woman, Rebecca, she spat, her voice shaking with rage. You have always been jealous of Jason, and you have always been jealous of me. You sit alone in your penthouse every night with your little security company, and you hate the fact that your brother has a beautiful wife, a perfect marriage, and a life you could never achieve. You are deliberately trying to destroy his family because you do not have your own. My mother nodded vigorously, dabbing her eyes with a linen napkin. She is right, my mother sobbed. You are trying to tear this family apart out of spite. Kendra was not finished. She paced back and forth behind her chair, waving her arms. We are not going to let you do this, she yelled, gesturing to the relatives who were watching the scene unfold like a car crash. Jason and I worked too hard to build our lifestyle. We are respected in the business community. We have standing. You are just an arrogant girl playing corporate raider. And I will personally see to it that our lawyers sue you for everything you are worth. We will tie you up in litigation for 10 years until you are begging us for a settlement. I let her finish her frantic speech. I let the echoes of her screaming bounce off the dining room walls until there was nothing left but heavy breathing. I reached for my water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. You can certainly try to sue me, Kendra, I replied, setting the glass down. But you might have a hard time retaining a decent lawyer. I initiated the asset freeze at noon today. By the way, you might want to check your purse. I instructed the bank to freeze your corporate credit card along with all the company accounts. Kendra froze mid-pace. Her eyes widened to the size of saucers. What did you just say? She whispered. I smiled, folding my hands on the table. Your corporate credit card is completely frozen. The one you used to buy that $12,000 watch you are wearing. The one you used to book your luxury ski trip to Aspen last month. As the new owner of Summit Tech, I have full access to the corporate expense reports. I am well aware that you have been illegally funneling company funds to maintain your lavish lifestyle while your employees go unpaid. You have no money, Kendra. The company is mine, and your accounts are locked. A sharp gasp escaped Kendra's lips. The elegant, composed woman vanished entirely, replaced by someone who was suddenly staring at the terrifying prospect of losing absolutely everything. No, she screamed, lunging forward against the table. You cannot do that. That is my money. You have no right. Jason grabbed her arm, trying to pull her back, but she shoved him away wildly. Let go of me! She shrieked, her voice cracking hysterically. Do you understand what she has done? We are ruined, Jason. We are completely ruined. Kendra grabbed her wine glass and hurled it blindly across the room. It shattered against the stone fireplace, sending shards of glass and dark red wine flying everywhere. The loud sound of the breaking glass shattered whatever restraint the rest of the family had left. Total chaos erupted around the long table. My mother screamed in terror, covering her head. My father lunged forward, yelling at me to get out of his house immediately. Aunts and uncles jumped from their seats, shouting in sheer confusion and grabbing their coats to escape the madness. Jason was desperately trying to restrain Kendra, who was now crying hysterically and knocking over dining chairs. Grandma Ruth quietly sipped her tea, watching the destruction with a faint, knowing smile. The perfect holiday facade, the elegant dinner, the carefully crafted illusion of the golden child and his flawless life, it was all smashed to pieces on the dining room floor. I stood up calmly, buttoned my dark winter coat, and walked straight toward the front door, leaving them all behind in the pathetic ruins of their own making. The crisp Monday morning air bit at my face as I stepped out of my car at the Summit Tech headquarters. My team from Aegis Cyber had already been inside since 6 in the morning, executing the final stages of the asset transition. It was all a hollow shell designed to look like a successful Silicon Valley startup, while the actual balance sheets bled dry. I set up my temporary workspace in what used to be the main conference room, watching my forensic auditors methodically combing through the network logs and employee records. They moved with military precision, locking down every single digital doorway. At exactly 9 o'clock, the elevator doors chimed and Jason strutted onto the floor. I watched him through the glass walls of the conference room. He was wearing a brand new navy blue tailored suit with a silk tie, acting as if the explosive Christmas dinner had never even happened. Jason was completely insulated by his own delusion. He believed that if he just walked into the office and acted like the CEO, everything would magically revert to normal. He thought my parents had somehow intimidated me into reversing the acquisition over the weekend. He thought he had won. He strolled down the main hallway whistling a faint tune until he noticed my team of auditors sitting at the clustered workstations. His confident stride faltered. He stopped dead in his tracks, staring at the men and women wearing black Aegis cyber jackets who were actively dismantling his corporate network. "Hey," he barked, his voice echoing across the open concept floor plan. "Who the hell let you people in here? This is a private corporate floor. Get up from those desks right now." My lead auditor, a broad-shouldered man named David, did not even look up from his dual monitors. He simply continued typing lines of code, seamlessly migrating the Summit Tech client databases onto our secure Aegis servers. The rest of the auditing team followed suit, completely ignoring Jason's outburst. They had their orders. Jason was a non-entity in this building. "Are you deaf?" Jason shouted, his face flushing an angry shade of red. He marched over to David's desk and slammed his fist down next to the keyboard. "I am the Chief Executive Officer of this company, and I am ordering you to vacate my premises immediately. If you do not pack up your equipment right now, I am calling the police and having you all arrested for corporate trespassing." David finally paused his typing. He slowly turned his head to look at Jason. His expression was completely blank. "You do not have the clearance to be in this sector," Sir David said calmly. "I suggest you step back and let us finish the network migration." The sheer disrespect from an employee broke something inside Jason's fragile ego. He looked around the office, realizing that his own staff, the few who had actually shown up to work unpaid, were watching him with a mixture of pity and secondhand embarrassment. He needed to assert his dominance immediately. He needed to prove he was still the king of this glass castle. "Fine," Jason snarled, pointing a finger at David. "You want to play games on my network? Let us see how well you work when your screens go dark." He turned around and stormed toward the main server room at the back of the floor. The server room was enclosed in thick reinforced glass, displaying the massive racks of blinking hardware that kept the company online. Jason swiped his old CEO badge at the scanner. Surprisingly, the scanner beeped green, and the heavy glass door clicked open. He smirked, thinking he still had ultimate access. He marched inside and immediately grabbed the thick cluster of master power cables connected to the primary switch. With a triumphant shout, he yanked the cables hard, attempting to physically disconnect the entire floor from the network. He never even noticed the small red Aegis cyber warning beacon mounted above the door. The moment the cables shifted, our proprietary security software detected an unauthorized physical breach on critical infrastructure. A loud electronic siren blared through the office. The heavy reinforced glass door of the server room instantly slammed shut behind Jason, and an automated magnetic lock engaged with a heavy metallic clank. Jason dropped the cables and rushed to the door, pushing against the glass. It did not budge. He swiped his badge frantically against the interior scanner, but the panel just flashed red. He pounded his fists against the thick soundproof glass, yelling demands that no one could hear. My brother, the golden child tech visionary, was now visibly trapped inside a glass cage of his own making, while my team continued their work without missing a single beat. I stepped out of the elevator onto the main floor, just in time to witness the pathetic spectacle. The entire office had stopped pretending to work. The remaining Summit Tech employees were standing around their cubicles, holding their coffee mugs and staring in stunned silence at the main server room. Inside the reinforced glass box, my older brother was pacing like a trapped animal. His face was slick with sweat, and his expensive silk tie was yanked loose around his neck. He was slamming the palm of his hand against the glass panel, mouthing words that no one could hear over the low hum of the office ventilation. I walked slowly across the open floor plan, making sure every single person in the room saw me. I did not rush. I wanted Jason to marinate in his own utter humiliation for a few more seconds. When I finally reached the server room, I pulled my Aegis Cybermaster access card from my pocket. I tapped it against the external scanner. The magnetic lock disengaged with a loud electronic click, and the heavy glass door hissed open. Jason stumbled forward, nearly losing his balance as he burst out of his self-imposed prison. He stood there panting, trying to regain his breath and his dignity, while 36 of his former employees watched him intently. Instead of walking away quietly, he decided to double down on his delusion. He straightened his jacket and pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "You think this is funny, Rebecca?" He hissed, his voice echoing loudly across the quiet office. "You think you can just march your people in here and treat me like a criminal in my own building? I am still the founder and the chief executive officer of this corporation. I do not care what kind of stunt you pulled on Christmas night to scare Mom and Dad. The legal closing date for this acquisition is not until this Friday at 5 in the afternoon. Until that ink is dry on the final contract, I still legally control 51% of the voting shares. I have the majority say. I am calling an emergency board meeting right now, and I am voiding this entire hostile takeover. And then I am going to have the building security team throw you and your little hackers out onto the street. You are done playing these childish games with my livelihood." I let him finish his desperate rant. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy. The unpaid staff watched me, waiting to see if their former boss actually had the power he claimed. I reached inside my blazer pocket and pulled out a single folded sheet of paper. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger or frustration. I just handed him the document. "You really should have read the fine print on the venture capital loans you took out last year, Jason," I said smoothly. "You were so desperate for cash to fund your luxury lifestyle and Kendra and her endless shopping sprees that you signed a standard distressed debt covenant without understanding the actual terms. Section 4, paragraph B, clearly states that if the borrower defaults on 3 consecutive payments or fails to make payroll for 2 consecutive cycles, all voting rights associated with the founders' equity shares immediately transfer to the primary debt holder. You triggered that specific default clause exactly 45 days ago, when you decided to buy a new car instead of paying your engineering team. When Aegis Cyber bought your debt yesterday morning, we did not just buy your hardware and your office lease. We bought your voting rights. You do not own 51% anymore, Jason. You own absolutely 0%. You are not a majority shareholder. You are not the chief executive officer. You do not even have the authority to order a paperclip in this building, let alone call an emergency board meeting. This takeover is absolute, and it is irreversible." The employees around us began to murmur among themselves, completely shocked by the brutal reality of his financial incompetence. Jason stared at the paper in his hands, his eyes darting frantically across the highlighted legal text. His chest heaved as his final desperate illusion of corporate power shattered into a million pieces right in front of the people he used to terrorize. He opened his mouth to argue, but he had absolutely nothing left to say. He dropped the thick legal paper directly onto the cold floor, turned around and practically sprinted toward the main elevators, leaving every last shred of his fabricated dignity far behind him. I watched the shiny metal elevator doors slide completely shut, knowing perfectly well that the real war had begun. I turned away from the glass walls and walked back to my temporary workspace in the center of the room. David and my auditing team had already resumed their tasks, typing away, as if the disruption with Jason never occurred. I sat down at the oak conference table and opened my laptop, checking the latest data migration reports. The transition was running smoothly. However, I knew my brother was only half of the problem. His wife was the other half, and she was much more dangerous when cornered. It took less than an hour for Kendra to make her grand entrance. I heard the sharp, rhythmic clicking of her designer heels hitting the hardwood floor before she appeared in the doorway. She did not knock. She simply pushed the glass door open and marched into my temporary office, closing it firmly behind her. She twisted the plastic wand on the window blinds, snapping them shut to block the view from the floor. Kendra looked entirely different from the hysterical woman who had thrown a wine glass at the fireplace on Christmas night. She had spent the morning meticulously assembling her armor. She wore a tailored white designer suit with her hair perfectly styled and her diamond jewelry catching the fluorescent lights. She stood at the opposite end of the long table, glaring at me with practiced victimhood and deep-seated arrogance. "I am not here to play the pathetic games you just played with Jason," she began, her voice icy. "You might have humiliated my husband in front of his staff, but you are not going to pull that with me. I know exactly what you are trying to do, and I am putting a stop to it right now." I did not offer her a seat. I simply folded my hands, resting them gently on top of my laptop keyboard. "What exactly am I trying to do, Kendra?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "You are trying to terminate my employment without cause simply because you have a personal vendetta against my marriage," she snapped. "You illegally froze my corporate accounts and you are attempting to lock me out of my own financial division. But I am the chief financial officer of Summit Tech. I have an ironclad executive employment contract. If you are dissolving this company and terminating my position, I demand my $250,000 severance package, processed and deposited into my personal banking account by the end of business today." I stared at her, letting an amused smile touch the corners of my mouth. "A severance package," I repeated softly. "You want $250,000 from a failing company that cannot afford to pay its janitorial staff?" "I do not care about the janitors," Kendra shot back, slamming her expensive leather handbag onto the polished wood table. "I care about my contract. And if you refuse to pay what I am legally owed, I promise you will regret it. I am not just going to walk away quietly, Rebecca. I will file a massive lawsuit against you and Aegis Cyber for wrongful termination, workplace harassment, and blatant racial discrimination." She leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table, her eyes narrowing into cold, dangerous slits. "Do you have any idea how that will look for your pristine little cybersecurity firm? A wealthy, privileged CEO executing a hostile corporate takeover just to spitefully fire her African-American sister-in-law. The local media will absolutely devour you. My legal team will drag your company through a brutal public relations nightmare. Your private investors will flee. Your lucrative federal contracts will be put under immediate review the second the press catches wind of a hostile workplace investigation." I listened to her aggressive threats without breaking eye contact for a single second. She was incredibly confident, leaning heavily on the social capital she thought she possessed. "I have the best employment litigators in the city on speed dial," Kendra continued, boasting proudly, tossing her hair. "They eat arrogant corporate raiders like you for breakfast. They will tie Aegis Cyber up in federal court for the next 5 years. You will bleed millions in legal fees alone. But I am a reasonable woman, Rebecca. I am willing to offer you a simple alternative. We can keep this entire situation quiet. You pay out my full severance package along with a $2 million settlement for emotional distress. You write the check today, and I sign a strict non-disclosure agreement. You get to save face, and I walk away quietly. It is the absolute smartest business decision you could possibly make for yourself today." I stared at her for a long moment, letting the sheer audacity of her extortion attempt hang in the quiet room. A $2 million settlement to save face. It was almost impressive how easily the threats rolled off her tongue. She stood there with her chin held high, completely convinced that she had backed me into a corner. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice or threaten to call my own lawyers. Instead, I reached out and gently took hold of my laptop. I turned the device around so the high-resolution screen was facing her directly. I tapped the spacebar to wake it up and opened the primary forensic accounting file that David had just finished compiling an hour ago. I think we have very different definitions of a smart business decision, Kendra, I said, keeping my voice dangerously low. I want you to look at this spreadsheet. Look at it very closely because this is what the federal government is going to see when they subpoena your financial records. Kendra scoffed, rolling her eyes, but she could not stop herself from looking down at the screen. Her confident posture stiffened almost immediately. The spreadsheet was a meticulous line-by-line breakdown of the Summit Tech operational expenses over the last 18 months. I had highlighted several dozen specific transactions in bright red. You are the chief financial officer? I continued, leaning back in my chair. You are legally responsible for the accuracy of these ledgers. Now, according to this document, Summit Tech spent $140,000 last quarter on what you categorized as redundant cloud server maintenance. That is a very technical-sounding category. The only problem is that Summit Tech does not use external cloud servers. You own all your hardware locally, so my auditors dug a little deeper into those specific vendor routing numbers. Kendra's face began to lose its color. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. It turns out that cloud server maintenance is actually the routing code for a luxury travel agency, I said, reading straight from the summary report. That $140,000 paid for your 2-week ski vacation to Aspen, your first-class flights to Paris, and your stays at 5-star resorts. But it gets better. Let us look at the line item for cybersecurity hardware upgrades. $85,000. That money went directly to the leasing company for the 2 luxury SUVs sitting in your driveway. And my personal favorite is the office supply discretionary fund. $40,000 disguised as printer ink and paper, which actually went to a high-end boutique downtown to pay for the designer bags you are currently carrying. I pointed to the expensive leather handbag she had just slammed on my table. You did not just mismanage this company, Kendra. You actively bled it dry. You embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from the operational budget while your engineering team was missing their rent payments because their paychecks bounced. You committed federal wire fraud and tax evasion on a massive scale. Kendra stepped back from the table as if the laptop had suddenly caught fire. Her hands were shaking. You cannot prove any of that, she whispered, her voice completely stripped of its previous arrogance. Those are legitimate business expenses. We entertain clients. We have to project an image of success. I tapped the trackpad, opening a folder containing scanned receipts and forged signature authorizations. I have the receipts, Kendra. I have the digital footprints. I have every single email you sent to your accounting staff ordering them to falsify the tax documents. I do not need to prove it to you. I only need to hand this encrypted flash drive over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They love white-collar crime cases, especially when the evidence is this neatly packaged. The threat of federal prison hung heavily in the air. The confident, aggressive woman who had stormed into my office demanding millions of dollars was completely gone. She looked small, terrified, and trapped. Here is my counteroffer, I said, closing the laptop with a sharp snap. You are going to walk out of this office right now. You are going to go to your desk and draft a formal letter of resignation. You are going to waive your right to any severance package, any uncashed stock options, and any future claims against this company. You walk away with absolutely nothing. If I do not have that signed resignation letter in my inbox within 24 hours, this audit goes directly to the FBI and the IRS. You will not be fighting a wrongful termination lawsuit, Kendra. You will be fighting for a reduced prison sentence. She stared at me, her chest heaving as panic set in. She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw another tantrum, but the cold, hard reality of the forensic evidence paralyzed her. She slowly reached out and grabbed her designer handbag, pulling it tightly against her chest like a shield. She did not say another word. She turned on her expensive heels and practically ran to the door. I watched her yank it open and flee down the hallway. She was terrified, but I saw the dark, desperate look in her eyes just before she turned away. She was completely cornered, and a cornered animal is incredibly dangerous. I knew she was not just going to walk away quietly. She was going to try something reckless, and I was fully prepared to let her dig her own grave. I left the office at 7 that evening, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. The data migration was ahead of schedule, and the toxic elements of Summit Tech had been neutralized. I drove back to my downtown penthouse, looking forward to a glass of wine and a quiet night. I swiped my fob at the private elevator, expecting the doors to open to an empty apartment. Instead, the moment the heavy oak doors parted, I was met with the overpowering scent of my mother's signature floral perfume. My parents were standing right in the middle of my living room. Richard and Susan had somehow bypassed the building's security concierge, probably by throwing a tantrum in the lobby, until the new evening guard let them up just to avoid a scene. They looked entirely out of place, standing on my imported rug, surrounded by the modern minimalist decor I had paid for with my own hard-earned money. My father had his arms crossed tightly over his chest, trying to project absolute authority, while my mother paced nervously near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. "How did you get in here?" I asked, stepping out of the elevator and dropping my keys onto the glass console table. I did not raise my voice, but the coldness in my tone was unmistakable. "You do not have authorization to be in this building. Do not use that corporate tone with us." "Rebecca," my father snapped, taking a heavy step forward. "We are your parents. We do not need an invitation to visit our own daughter, especially after the disgraceful stunt you pulled this morning." Jason called us in tears. "He told us you locked him in a server room and paraded him around like a common criminal in front of his own employees. You completely humiliated your own brother. He humiliated himself," Richard first replied, walking past them to the kitchen island. I poured myself a glass of iced water, keeping my movements slow and deliberate. "He defaulted on his loans and lost his company. I simply took out the trash." My mother let out a dramatic gasp, rushing forward to stand right next to my father. "You will not speak about him that way," she cried, her voice shrill and demanding. "He is a brilliant man who just hit a minor financial bump in the road. You owe him your unconditional support. We came here tonight to give you one final chance to make things right and fix this terrible mess you created." "A final chance," I repeated, taking a slow sip of water. "I am listening. Tell me what you want." "You are going to appoint Jason as the Chief Operating Officer of Aegis Cyber," my father demanded, his face turning an angry shade of red. "You are going to give him an executive salary, a corner office, and public credit for the merger. You will issue a press release tomorrow morning stating that the two of you are running the company together as equal partners. If you refuse to do this, Rebecca, we will cut you out of this family forever. You will be entirely excommunicated. No more holidays, no more phone calls, no more family. You will be dead to us." I set my glass down on the cool marble counter, staring at them in absolute disbelief. "You are threatening to disown me if I do not give a failed CEO the keys to my highly successful cybersecurity firm?" I asked. "You really think your presence in my life is worth destroying my entire company for?" "He deserves to be at the top," my mother insisted, stepping closer. "We always knew he was going to do great things. That is exactly why we took that $200,000 from your college fund years ago to help him start his business." I felt a cold flash of anger burn deep in my chest. "You did not take it," I corrected her sharply. "You stole it. That money was left to me by my grandfather for my education, and you forged my signature to drain the account." "We made a strategic family investment," my father yelled, pointing his thick finger at me again. "Jason had a massive vision. He had more potential than you ever did. We knew he could build a massive tech empire, and he just needed the seed money. You were just a girl who liked playing with computer code in the basement. You never needed that much money for a simple state college degree anyway. We made the right choice investing in your brother, and now it is your turn to invest in him to secure his future." I looked at their completely angry faces, realizing they would never change their stubborn minds. My father took another step toward me, his face now twisted into an ugly mask of pure resentment. He hated being reminded of his own financial crimes, especially by the daughter he had always considered beneath him. "If you want to play hardball, Rebecca, we can play hardball," he growled, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. You think you are so independent because you have this fancy apartment and your little security company. But you are forgetting about the family trust. You are forgetting about the historic estate. That property is worth over $2 million. If you do not draft the paperwork right now to make your brother the chief operating officer of your company, I will call my lawyer first thing tomorrow morning. I will remove you from the family trust completely. You will not see a single dime of our estate, and you will never set foot in that historic house again. My mother nodded vigorously, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. And we will not stop there, she added, her voice dripping with venom. We know all the influential people in this city. We are highly respected members of the country club. If you refuse to help your brother, we will make sure everyone in the local business community knows exactly what kind of monster you really are. We will tell them how you stole your brother's life work out of pure jealousy. We will ruin your professional reputation, Rebecca. No one will ever want to do business with a corporate vulture who preys on her own flesh and blood. You will be a total pariah. I stood perfectly still, letting their pathetic ultimatums wash over me. They truly believed that the promise of future money and the threat of country club gossip would be enough to break me. They were using the exact same manipulation tactics they had used when I was a teenager, but I was no longer a frightened child, desperate for their approval. I looked my father dead in the eye. Keep the house, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Keep your trust fund, and keep your country club memberships. I built my company with zero help from you, and I certainly do not need your inheritance to survive. Jason will never hold a position at Aegis Cyber. He is a massive financial liability and a proven fraud. Now get out of my apartment before I have the lobby security guards drag you out by your collars. They stared at me in stunned silence, realizing that their absolute best weapons had completely failed to leave even a single scratch. My father cursed under his breath, grabbing my mother's arm and dragging her toward the elevator. They left my penthouse, slamming the heavy oak doors behind them. But they did not waste any time executing their threats. By the time I woke up the next morning, the smear campaign was already in full swing. My mother had taken to Facebook, posting a lengthy, tearful essay about how her family was being torn apart by corporate greed. She painted Jason as a hard-working visionary who had been ruthlessly tricked by his greedy, vindictive sister during the holidays. She tagged dozens of extended family members and local community leaders, making sure the dramatic post went completely viral within our social circle. The toxic gossip spread through the local country club like a raging wildfire. My parents spent their entire Tuesday morning sitting in the clubhouse dining room playing the role of the devastated victims. They told anyone who would listen that I had used illegal loopholes to steal Summit Tech right out from under Jason while he was distracted trying to provide for his wife. They called me a corporate vulture, a sociopath, and a bitter, lonely woman who desperately wanted to destroy her brother's happiness. My phone began vibrating endlessly with notifications. Distant relatives were sending me angry text messages demanding that I explain my horrific behavior. A few local business owners who knew my parents reached out to express their profound disappointment in my lack of family loyalty. My parents were systematically trying to poison the well, hoping the intense social pressure would finally force me to surrender my company to their golden child. They honestly thought this public humiliation would break my spirit. They expected me to issue a tearful public apology and beg for their forgiveness, just to make the endless notifications stop. Instead, I simply silenced my phone and poured myself a fresh hot cup of coffee. I let them spin their desperate web of lies, knowing that their fabricated narrative was about to collide with a brutal legal reality. The absolute truth was finally going to destroy them, and I was completely ready for it. By Wednesday morning, the fallout from my parents' social media frenzy began to bleed directly into my professional life. My office phone rang incessantly. The receptionist at Aegis Cyber was fielding calls from confused vendors and concerned local business partners who had seen the dramatic Facebook posts. My mother had not just stopped at tagging extended family. She had intentionally tagged the official business pages of local Chamber of Commerce members and regional tech networking groups. She was weaponizing her country club connections to paint a massive target on my back. At 10 o'clock, my director of client relations knocked on my glass door, looking incredibly stressed. He handed me a tablet displaying 3 different emails from some of our smaller regional clients. They were all requesting immediate meetings to discuss the ethics of our recent business practices. They used polite corporate language, but the underlying message was crystal clear. They were nervous about being associated with a chief executive officer who supposedly operated with such ruthless and predatory tactics against her own flesh and blood. One client even threatened to pause their annual security contract renewal until the ugly family dispute was publicly resolved to their satisfaction. Most executives facing a public relations crisis of this magnitude would immediately panic. They would issue a carefully worded press release or hire a crisis management firm to do extensive damage control. They would bend over backward to reassure their clients and squash the rumors before they could affect the quarterly bottom line. But I did not panic, and I certainly did not issue a public apology to appease my angry parents. I simply handed the tablet back to my director and told him to schedule those client meetings for late next week. I wanted to give my parents a few more days to feel completely invincible. Instead of calling a public relations firm, I picked up my phone and called my lead corporate attorney. I asked him to come up to my office immediately. When he arrived, I showed him the printed screenshots of my mother's viral posts and my father's vicious comments on local community message boards. My attorney read through the printed pages, his eyebrows raising higher with every single sentence. He immediately suggested we send out aggressive cease and desist letters to both of my parents right away to stop the reputational bleeding. I shook my head and told him no. I did not want to stop them just yet. I instructed him to draft the cease and desist documents to make sure they were perfectly legally sound, but to keep them locked away in his desk drawer. I explained my strategy to him very clearly. If we sent those warning letters right now, my parents would just play the ultimate victim card again. They would run right back to their country club friends and claim that I was using expensive corporate lawyers to illegally bully and silence them. It would only validate their ridiculous emotional narrative. Instead, I wanted to let them keep talking. I wanted them to keep posting, gossiping, and spreading their toxic lies to absolutely anyone who would listen. In the legal system, defamation is notoriously difficult to prove unless you can show absolute quantifiable financial damages. By allowing them to continue their unhinged smear campaign, and by letting our smaller clients threaten to pause their lucrative contracts, my parents were actively creating the exact paper trail of financial damages I desperately needed to destroy them in a court of law. Every lost contract and every canceled meeting was just adding another zero to the massive defamation lawsuit I was quietly building against them. My attorney smiled, finally understanding exactly what I was doing. We were giving them enough rope to hang themselves legally and financially. Over the next 48 hours, I maintained absolute silence. I did not respond to a single text message from angry relatives. I did not comment on my mother's endless social media posts. I simply went to work, managed the integration of the acquired assets, and let the digital storm rage outside my glass office walls. My parents took my silence as an absolute victory. They genuinely believed that I was cowering in my penthouse, too embarrassed and ashamed to face the public backlash. Emboldened by their perceived triumph, my father decided to escalate the situation even further. He began calling local journalists trying to pitch a feature story about the dark side of corporate tech acquisitions, using his precious son as the ultimate tragic victim. He was so completely blinded by his desperate need to protect his golden boy that he never realized he was walking right into a devastating legal trap. He thought he was ruining my professional reputation, but he was actually just writing me a massive blank check. I watched it all unfold with perfect calm, ready for the next move. The call I had been waiting for finally came on Thursday evening. It was not from my lawyer or an angry client. It was from my grandmother, Ruth. She did not ask how my week was going or mention the circus my parents had created online. She simply told me to come to the historic family estate at exactly 8 o'clock for a mandatory emergency family meeting. Her voice was steady and carried an ancient authority that no one ever dared to question. I knew exactly what this meeting represented. My parents had run crying to the matriarch of the family, begging her to use her ultimate emotional leverage to force me into submission. They honestly thought they had finally found the undeniable weapon I could not defeat with a legal document. I drove up the long, winding gravel driveway of the family estate just before 8. The property was a massive colonial mansion sitting on 3 acres of pristine land, located in the most exclusive neighborhood in the city. It was the crown jewel of our family history and the ultimate symbol of my parents' fabricated wealth. They used this house to project an image of old money and untouchable high society status to their wealthy country club friends. I parked my car behind my brother's newly leased luxury sedan and walked up the wide stone steps, feeling the cool night air against my face. The atmosphere inside the grand living room was thick with unearned arrogance. My parents were sitting together on the expensive vintage velvet sofa. My mother Susan was holding a delicate porcelain teacup, looking incredibly smug. My father Richard was standing near the grand stone fireplace, projecting the absolute confidence of a man who believed he had already won the war. Jason and his wife Kendra were sitting across from them in matching imported leather armchairs. Kendra was wearing another brand new expensive designer outfit, completely ignoring the terrifying fact that she was currently being investigated for federal wire fraud. She looked at me with a sickeningly sweet smile, thinking she had successfully used the family hierarchy to save her stolen millions. When I walked into the room, no one offered a polite greeting. My father just pointed a stern finger to a hard wooden chair placed deliberately in the center of the room like an interrogation seat. "Sit down right there, Rebecca," my father commanded, his voice echoing loudly off the high vaulted ceilings. "Your grandmother is going to be joining us in a moment. We have discussed your completely unacceptable behavior over the past few days, and she fully agrees that this family needs to have a serious intervention before you do any more permanent damage to your brother's life and career." I did not sit in the interrogation chair. I remained standing near the heavy wooden doorway, slowly folding my arms across my chest. "You really dragged an 82-year-old woman into your pathetic corporate temper tantrum?" I asked, looking directly at Jason. Jason stood up from his comfortable leather chair, walking slowly toward me with a wide, victorious smirk plastered across his face. He felt completely untouchable standing inside the walls of the grand family estate. "We did not drag her into anything, Rebecca," he said, laughing softly, shaking his head. "She saw exactly what you are doing to this family. She saw the viral social media posts, and she completely understands that your petty lifelong jealousy is tearing us all apart. You thought you could use a legal technicality to steal my company and ruin my beautiful marriage, but you forgot who actually runs this family. Grandma Ruth is going to put an end to this tonight." He stepped closer, deliberately invading my personal space to try and intimidate me. "And since you decided to put me and my wife through so much severe emotional distress this week, the terms of my return have officially changed." Jason continued, his tone dripping with absolute entitlement and unchecked greed. "I am not just taking Summit Tech back. When Grandma Ruth orders you to reverse the acquisition tonight, you are also going to hand over the master access keys to the Aegis Cyber primary servers. I will be taking a mandatory 30% equity stake in your highly profitable company as formal compensation for the public defamation and the severe mental anguish you caused me. You are going to work for me now, little sister, and you are going to learn your place." My mother nodded enthusiastically from the velvet sofa, taking a sip of her tea. "It is the only fair and decent way to make things right after the horrible stress you put his poor wife through," my mother added, gesturing warmly toward Kendra. I looked at my older brother, marveling at the sheer magnitude of his financial delusion. He genuinely believed that an elderly woman had the legal authority to reverse a federal corporate acquisition and force me to hand over a multi-million-dollar cybersecurity firm just because he was throwing a childish tantrum. He thought the historic estate we were standing in gave him some kind of magical royal authority over reality. I did not argue with him. I did not even bother explaining how binding federal contracts actually worked. I simply looked past his shoulder as the heavy oak doors of the adjoining library slowly opened. Grandma Ruth walked into the room, leaning heavily on her wooden cane, holding a thick manila folder in her free hand, completely ready to destroy their fabricated reality. Grandma Ruth moved slowly but with absolute purpose. The rhythmic tapping of her wooden cane against the hardwood floor commanded the immediate attention of everyone in the room. Jason rushed forward, his face instantly transforming from an arrogant sneer into a mask of sweet familial devotion. He reached out to offer her his arm, playing the role of the perfect, respectful grandson. "Let me help you sit down, Grandma," he said, his voice dripping with fake affection. "We are so glad you are here to finally talk some sense into her. She has gone completely out of her mind." Grandma Ruth did not take his arm. She did not even look at him. She walked right past Jason, leaving him standing awkwardly in the middle of the room with his hand outstretched. She made her way to the heavy oak coffee table positioned perfectly between the vintage velvet sofa and the leather armchairs. She placed the thick manila folder onto the polished wood with a heavy thud. "Sit down, Jason," she commanded, her voice sharp and unwavering. "And keep your mouth shut until I'm finished speaking." Jason blinked in surprise, but the tone of her voice left absolutely no room for argument. He retreated to his leather chair, sitting down next to Kendra, who was now looking slightly nervous. My father, Richard, stood taller, puffing out his chest. "Thank you for coming, Mother," my father said, gesturing toward me with a look of utter disgust. "We have already informed Rebecca of the consequences if she refuses to cooperate. I told her that if she does not return the company to Jason tonight, I am writing her out of the family trust. I will make sure she never inherits a single brick of this historic estate. She needs to understand that actions have permanent consequences." Grandma Ruth slowly unclasped the metal fastener of the manila folder. She looked up at my father, her eyes narrowing with intense disappointment. "You are absolutely right, Richard," she said quietly. "Actions do have permanent consequences. But you seem to have forgotten your own actions." She pulled a stack of stapled legal documents from the folder and tossed them onto the table. "There is no family trust," she announced, her voice echoing through the silent room. "There is no inheritance, and you certainly do not have the power to write anyone out of this estate because you do not own a single brick of it yourself." My mother's teacup rattled violently against her porcelain saucer. "Richard, what is she talking about?" my mother whispered, her eyes darting frantically between my father and my grandmother. My father had turned completely pale. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. "I will tell you what I am talking about, Susan," Grandma Ruth continued, turning her sharp gaze toward my mother. "3 years ago, your husband made a series of incredibly reckless financial investments. He tried to play the stock market using the equity of this house as collateral. He lost everything. 3 years ago, Richard secretly filed for absolute bankruptcy. He came to me crying in the middle of the night, begging for help, because the bank was going to foreclose on this property and throw you both out onto the street." Jason stared at our father in absolute shock. "Dad, is this true?" Jason asked, his voice trembling. "You are bankrupt." My father sank down onto the velvet sofa, covering his face with his hands. He could not even look at his golden boy. "I could not let my own son become homeless." Grandma Ruth explained, her voice softening just a fraction before hardening again. "But I did not have the cash to save him. So I reached out to a private buyer. I arranged for an anonymous corporate entity to purchase this historic estate entirely in cash. The funds from that private sale paid off Richard's massive debts and kept him out of federal prison. The new owner graciously allowed you both to continue living here, rent-free, so you could maintain your precious country club image and your local social status. Grandma Ruth reached into the folder one last time and pulled out the official property deed. It had a heavy gold seal pressed into the bottom corner. She held it up so the entire room could see it clearly. "You threatened to disinherit her," Richard. Grandma Ruth said, her tone dripping with cold, righteous anger. "You threatened to kick her out of this house. But you cannot kick the landlord out of her own property. The anonymous buyer who saved you from total ruin was Rebecca. She currently owns this entire massive estate. Your pathetic blackmail threat is now completely worthless." The air in the grand library evaporated completely. My father stood frozen, staring at the property deed in my grandmother's hand, as the reality of his complete financial impotence crashed down on him. He had absolutely nothing left to threaten me with. Jason and Kendra did not stay to watch the rest of my parents' humiliation. They realized instantly that the protective family safety net they had relied on for their entire lives was nothing but a fragile illusion. Without saying a single word to anyone, Jason grabbed his wife by the arm and practically dragged her out of the room. I listened to the heavy front doors slam shut and the screeching tires of their least luxury sedan as they fled the estate. They were finally completely out of legal options, and they had absolutely nowhere left to hide from the absolute truth. Or so I thought. When cornered rats do not simply accept defeat, they look for a way to chew through the walls to survive. Later that night, Jason and Kendra sat in the massive kitchen of their own heavily mortgaged home, surrounded by the expensive appliances and imported marble countertops they could no longer afford. The silence between them was thick with panic and mutual resentment. Kendra had finally confessed the terrifying truth about the 24-hour ultimatum I had given her. She explained the forensic audit, the highlighted spreadsheets, and the fact that I possessed undeniable digital proof of her massive embezzlement. She told him about the looming threat of a federal investigation that would inevitably end with both of them sitting in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and tax evasion. Jason paced across the kitchen floor, his mind racing frantically for a way out. He absolutely refused to be the man who lost everything to his younger sister. He remembered the specific legal timeline I had laid out for him in the server room. The hostile takeover had been initiated, and his voting rights were gone, but the absolute final legal handover, the moment the ink dried on the permanent transition of all digital assets, was not scheduled until Friday evening. He still had roughly 48 hours. In his desperate, delusional mind, that small window of time was all he needed to execute a catastrophic backup plan. He stopped pacing and looked at Kendra, his eyes wide with a manic, dangerous energy. He laid out his desperate strategy. Summit Tech possessed the proprietary source code and the highly confidential client databases for 3 major regional hospital networks. That medical data and the custom software architecture protecting it were worth millions of dollars to the right buyer. Jason knew that a direct competitor, a ruthless tech firm located just across the state line, had been trying to poach those specific hospital contracts for the last 5 years. If Jason could secretly download the master source code files onto an encrypted external hard drive, he could sell the stolen data to the rival firm under the table. It was blatant corporate espionage and a massive federal crime, but Jason was completely past the point of caring about the law or morality. He told Kendra that the rival chief executive officer would gladly pay a massive, untraceable cash bounty for that kind of proprietary advantage. Kendra listened to her husband, her heart pounding against her ribs. Under normal circumstances, she might have hesitated. But the terrifying image of the Federal Bureau of Investigation raiding her home and seizing her designer assets pushed her right over the edge. She did not just agree with his illegal plan, she actively began helping him refine it. She realized that a massive under-the-table cash payout was their only viable ticket to avoid a long prison sentence. They stayed up until the early hours of the morning plotting their desperate escape. Kendra promised to use the stolen cash to immediately wire funds into an offshore account she had quietly set up in the Cayman Islands years ago. They planned to pack their bags, buy 2 one-way flight tickets out of the country, and vanish before my auditing team could finalize the corporate paperwork on Friday. Jason was convinced that because he was the original founder, he could easily bypass the new security protocols my team had installed on the main servers. He believed he knew the Summit Tech network architecture better than anyone else in the world. He genuinely thought he could just walk into the building in the middle of the night, plug in a drive, and walk out a millionaire, leaving me with an empty, useless company. It was a perfectly executed plan in his delusional mind. They were both absolutely certain that I was far too distracted to ever see this betrayal coming. At 2 o'clock in the morning on Friday, the streets of the downtown business district were completely empty. Jason drove his leased luxury sedan through the quiet city, taking carefully calculated back routes to avoid the major traffic cameras. He parked 3 blocks away from the Summit Tech headquarters in a dimly lit underground parking garage. He wore a dark hooded jacket over a black shirt, trying to look inconspicuous, but the entire stealth aesthetic was just another part of his massive ego trip. He actually felt like a brilliant corporate spy executing a master heist instead of a desperate failure stealing from his own sister. He walked briskly down the empty sidewalk, clutching a high-capacity encrypted hard drive inside his jacket pocket. When he reached the glass doors of the Summit Tech lobby, he did not even flinch. He knew the night security guard was a heavy sleeper who spent his entire shift watching movies on his phone in the basement break room. But more importantly, Jason had a secret weapon. Years ago, when he first leased the building, he had secretly instructed the contractors to wire a secondary manual bypass into the rear loading dock door, specifically to avoid being tracked by his own security system when he wanted to leave the office unnoticed. He slipped down the narrow alley behind the building, punched a simple 4-digit code into the hidden keypad, and heard the satisfying mechanical click of the heavy steel door unlocking. He stepped into the dark, silent building. He bypassed the elevators knowing they required active keycards and took the emergency concrete stairwell all the way up to his corporate floor. His heart was pounding loudly in his chest, fueled by a toxic mixture of pure adrenaline and absolute arrogance. He pushed open the stairwell door and stepped onto the main floor. The office was pitch black except for the faint blue glow coming from the glass-enclosed server room at the far end of the hallway. Jason smiled to himself. He had fully expected to find my Aegis cyber team running active 24-hour patrols, or at least an upgraded biometric lock on the server room door. Instead, everything looked exactly the same as he had left it. He walked confidently toward the server room, shaking his head in disgust. He genuinely believed that my highly praised cybersecurity firm was a total joke. He swiped his old administrative badge, hoping the scanner had a cached memory. The light flashed green, and the glass door slid open with a soft hiss. He stepped into the freezing cold room surrounded by the towering racks of blinking servers that housed the proprietary hospital source code. He walked directly to the primary terminal, pulled the heavy encrypted hard drive from his jacket, and plugged the physical cable directly into the master port. Jason cracked his knuckles, hovering his hands over the keyboard. He typed in his original administrative override credentials. The screen went black for a split second before the Summit Tech logo appeared, granting him full system access. He let out a loud, triumphant laugh. "You are so stupid, Rebecca," he whispered to the empty room. He quickly navigated through the file directories, locating the 3 massive database folders containing the proprietary hospital architecture and the encrypted client records. He selected all 3 folders and dragged them directly onto his external hard drive. A wide gray progress bar popped up on the monitor, calculating the massive file transfer. The estimated time was 20 minutes. As the blue bar slowly began to fill, Jason felt an overwhelming surge of absolute power. He had done it. He had outsmarted the brilliant cybersecurity chief executive officer. He was about to walk out of the building with millions of dollars worth of stolen intellectual property securely tucked inside his pocket. He leaned back in the rolling chair, watching the data transfer climb to 10%. The intoxicating thrill of victory was simply too much for him to contain. He needed to rub it in my face. He needed me to know that he was still the smartest person in the room. He pulled his smartphone out of his pocket and opened his camera application. He snapped a clear, high-resolution photograph of the computer monitor, making sure the glowing blue downloading progress bar and the specific hospital file names were perfectly visible in the shot. He opened our text message thread. He attached the incriminating photograph and quickly typed out a mocking message. "You might have bought the office furniture, little sister, but I am taking the actual value. Enjoy your worthless empty shell. See you at the closing table." He hit send, smiling, as the message delivered, completely unaware that he had just documented his own federal crime. I was sitting in the living room of my dark penthouse when the bright screen of my smartphone suddenly illuminated the coffee table. The digital clock in the corner of the screen read 2:20 in the morning. I had not been asleep. In fact, I had been sitting there in the quiet darkness for the last half hour, watching the real-time security alerts flash across the screen of my laptop. When my brother Jason sent that first arrogant text message complete with a high-resolution photograph of a downloading progress bar, I did not feel fear or panic. I felt a profound sense of closure. He had finally crossed the absolute point of no return. My phone vibrated again, sliding an inch across the glass table. Then it vibrated a third time, and a fourth. Jason was riding a massive wave of pure adrenaline, and his desperate need to gloat was completely overriding any remaining shred of his common sense. I picked up the phone and watched his rapid-fire text messages scroll down the screen. "You thought you could outsmart me," he wrote. "You thought you could just walk into my building and take everything I built. But you forgot who actually designed the Summit Tech network architecture. I am the founder, Rebecca. I hold the master keys." Another message popped up immediately. "That little progress bar in the photo I just sent you. That is the master source code for the regional hospital networks. Every single piece of proprietary software, every encrypted client database, every custom firewall configuration. I am downloading all of it right now onto a secure drive." He was openly confessing to federal corporate espionage via text message. It was almost sad how reckless he had become. But he was not finished. "I already have a buyer lined up," he continued, his messages growing increasingly unhinged and frantic. "A major competitor. They are going to pay me millions of dollars in untraceable cash for this data. Kendra and I are taking the money, and we are leaving the country before your auditors even wake up on Friday morning. We will be sitting on a beautiful beach while you are stuck trying to explain to your wealthy investors why you bought an empty corporate shell with zero client data." The messages kept rolling in, painting a vivid picture of his complete delusion. "You are going to be the absolute laughingstock of the entire tech industry," he typed. "The media is going to destroy you. Mom and Dad were absolutely right about you from the start. You are just a bitter, vindictive girl who got incredibly lucky. But your luck just ran out, little sister. Tomorrow morning you are going to wake up ruined. Enjoy the bankruptcy." I read every single word, feeling the cold, smooth metal of my phone in my hand. He was so thoroughly convinced of his own untouchable genius. He genuinely believed he had just successfully executed the heist of the century right under the nose of a top-tier cybersecurity firm. He thought I was sitting in my apartment crying over my massive financial loss. He wanted me to beg him to stop. He wanted me to offer him a massive financial payout to leave the proprietary data on the servers. He wanted to feel like a god. Instead, I opened my Aegis Cyber Administrative dashboard on my laptop. I verified that the automated security protocols had engaged exactly as they were designed to do. The system confirmed that the external hard drive currently plugged into Terminal 4 was actively receiving data, but I knew exactly what kind of data it was receiving. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the peaceful silence of my penthouse completely calm my racing mind. I picked up my smartphone and tapped the empty text field at the bottom of his long, unhinged monologue. I did not write a long paragraph defending myself. I did not threaten to call the local police or beg him to reconsider his foolish actions. I did not even mention our parents. I simply typed out a single perfectly calculated line. Did you really think the CEO of a cybersecurity firm wouldn't change the locks? I finally hit send and placed the phone face down on the glass table. I did not need to see his response. I could perfectly imagine the sheer paralyzing terror suddenly washing over his sweaty face as he read those exact words, standing all alone in the freezing cold server room. Then I closed my laptop, feeling a deep, permanent sense of finality. The steel trap had been completely sprung. Jason had deliberately chosen to walk into the raging fire all by himself, and now there was absolutely nothing left for him but ashes. Jason stood in the freezing server room, staring at the single sentence glowing on his smartphone screen. Did you really think the chief executive officer of a cybersecurity firm would not change the locks? The words hit him like a physical blow to the chest. For a brief second, cold panic gripped his heart. He looked down at the encrypted hard drive resting in his hand. The blue indicator light was solid, meaning the transfer was completely finished. He shook his head violently, refusing to believe my text message. He convinced himself I was making an empty threat. He believed I was powerless and just trying to scare him. He slipped the drive into his jacket pocket and hurried out of the dark office building. He drove his sedan across the city to an old concrete parking garage. This was the agreed meeting place. The rival firm was run by an executive named Bradley. He had agreed to pay $3 million in untraceable funds for the master source code. Jason pulled his car onto the third level of the empty parking garage. He parked next to a black utility vehicle with a running engine. He walked over to the passenger side of the black vehicle. He climbed inside the warm leather interior. Bradley sat inside, illuminated by a high-end laptop. Bradley did not offer a friendly greeting. He held out his hand, demanding the drive. Jason handed over the small metal device, feeling a surge of nervous anticipation. He told Bradley that the drive contained everything, including the proprietary firewall architecture and the unencrypted patient database directories. He plugged the drive into his laptop to verify all the stolen assets before authorizing the wire transfer. Jason leaned over the center console, eagerly watching the laptop screen. He expected familiar file structures to pop up and Bradley to smile. Instead, a strange black window opened on the screen. Lines of meaningless digital text began scrolling down the monitor at a blinding speed. It was not source code or hospital records. It was an endless loop of randomly generated junk data. Bradley frowned and clicked his mouse frantically, trying to bypass the chaotic scrolling text to find the actual root folders. But there were no root folders. The entire high-capacity drive was completely filled with billions of lines of absolute digital garbage. Then the scrolling text suddenly stopped. The entire computer screen flashed bright red. A massive white emblem appeared perfectly centered on the monitor. It was the official corporate logo of Aegis Cyber. Below the logo, a bold warning message was displayed in plain English. This stated that the connected device contained a tracking beacon and that unauthorized access of the simulated server environment had been fully logged and reported to federal authorities. The laptop speakers emitted a loud, piercing alarm tone that echoed inside the enclosed cabin of the vehicle. Bradley stared at the glowing red screen in absolute horror. He realized instantly that he was not buying any stolen corporate secrets. He was holding a digitally infected tracking device that was currently broadcasting his exact physical location to a federal cybersecurity grid. He turned his head and looked at Jason with pure, unadulterated rage. "You absolute idiot!" Bradley screamed, his face contorting with panic and fury. "You did not steal anything. You walked right into a federal trap and you brought it directly to me." Jason stammered, completely unable to comprehend what he was looking at. He reached for the laptop, trying to explain that it must be some kind of minor firewall error. Bradley violently slapped his right hand away. He grabbed the encrypted hard drive and ripped it out of the laptop port, permanently damaging the metal connector. He threw the useless device directly at Jason's chest. "Get out of my car!" Bradley yelled, leaning across the center console and shoving Jason toward the passenger door. "You are completely radioactive, and I will not let you drag my company down with you. Never contact me again." Jason stumbled backward, falling out of the vehicle and landing hard on the cold concrete floor of the parking garage. He watched helplessly as Bradley slammed the heavy door shut. The black vehicle accelerated instantly, tires screeching loudly against the pavement as Bradley fled the scene in sheer panic. Jason was left sitting entirely alone in the dark, damp parking garage. The encrypted hard drive lay on the ground next to him, completely useless. The reality of his situation finally crushed him. There was no $3 million payout. There was no tropical beach getaway. He had successfully recorded himself committing federal corporate espionage just to steal a drive full of digital garbage. He had absolutely nothing left but the terrifying guarantee of a long prison sentence. The sun rose over the city on Friday morning, casting a cold, bright light across the Aegis Cyber headquarters. I was sitting at my conference table with David, my lead security architect. A digital monitor displayed the complete forensic breakdown of the security breach from the night before. I watched the brightly colored data lines trace my brother's exact digital footsteps. "He really thought he was a ghost," David said, shaking his head in amusement. "He used the manual override at the loading dock just like you predicted, and he used his original administrative credentials to log into Terminal 4. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling absolute vindication. "Jason was incredibly predictable," I replied, keeping my eyes on the logs. "The moment we discovered Kendra's massive embezzlement scheme on Monday, I knew they were going to panic. They needed untraceable cash to flee the country, and the proprietary hospital source code was the only valuable asset they could liquidate. We anticipated their desperate criminal mindset perfectly, and we prepared our defenses to ensure they would fall right into our trap without noticing a thing." David tapped his tablet, bringing up the timeline of the digital trap we had set. "When we initiated the hostile takeover, we did not just migrate the client databases," David explained, summarizing the flawless execution. "The moment our software infiltrated the Summit Tech network, we completely cloned the directory structure. We moved the real encrypted patient data onto our secure servers, and we left the physical Summit Tech hardware running a perfectly mirrored simulation. We built a digital sandbox." Exactly, I said, setting my coffee mug down. A digital sandbox is a quarantined artificial environment designed to look and react exactly like the real thing. When Jason snuck into the building at 2 in the morning, he thought he was bypassing our security. He thought we had forgotten to change the passwords. But we left those specific credentials active entirely on purpose. We wanted him to walk right through the front door of the simulation, completely unaware that we were watching and recording his every move. When he plugged his encrypted hard drive into that terminal, he was isolated from the actual hospital data. I continued smiling coldly. He spent 20 minutes downloading randomly generated junk code that our artificial intelligence had disguised with familiar file names. He never stole a single piece of real information. He just stole a highly sophisticated tracking beacon that immediately infected the computer of the rival executive he tried to sell it to. The entire operation was a complete failure from the start. David let out a low whistle, pulling up the legal statutes. "It was a brilliant countermeasure," he said. "But since he did not actually steal any proprietary data, can we still hold him legally accountable for the breach? Will the federal authorities prosecute him for downloading fake files from a simulated environment that we specifically designed to trick him?" I nodded, leaning forward to look at the legal definitions. "The federal government does not care about the actual value of the stolen data in a digital espionage case," I explained, perfectly calm. "The law focuses entirely on the intent of the perpetrator and the unauthorized access of a restricted corporate network." Jason willfully bypassed physical building security. He knowingly initiated an unauthorized data transfer with the explicit intent to sell corporate secrets to a direct competitor for personal financial gain. I pointed to the wall monitor displaying his text messages and the photograph of the downloading progress bar. "Furthermore, he provided us with a written confession," I added. "His text messages prove his malicious intent beyond a shadow of a doubt. The fact that he was too stupid to realize he was stealing fake data does not magically erase the felony. He committed federal trade secret theft and criminal corporate espionage." The federal prosecutors are going to absolutely love the concrete evidence we have handed them. I pressed the green button on our commercial printer. The heavy machine whirred to life, immediately spitting out thick stacks of printed paper. I am printing the complete network access logs, the security camera footage from the alley, and the transcripts of his text messages I told David while neatly organizing the warm pages into 3 manila folders. The final closing meeting for the corporate acquisition is scheduled for exactly 5 this evening. Jason and Kendra are going to walk into that boardroom thinking they still have leverage. They will expect me to negotiate a massive financial payout to keep their secrets hidden. I want these folders sitting right in front of them when they finally realize they are going straight to federal prison. They will have absolutely no legal defense and no chance of escaping the consequences. Jason sat on the cold concrete floor of the parking garage, his mind violently rejecting the reality of his situation. The red tracking alert on the laptop screen flashed repeatedly in his head like a neon sign pointing directly to a federal prison. He scrambled to his feet, his expensive dark clothing covered in damp concrete dust. He lunged for the discarded hard drive, grabbing the damaged metal casing. He shoved it into his pocket and ran back to his luxury sedan. He needed to get home immediately. He needed to figure out how to cover his tracks before my team officially handed the logs over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He sped through the quiet morning streets, his hands gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. When he arrived at his massive, heavily mortgaged suburban home, he did not bother parking in the garage. He slammed the brakes, leaving the car idling in the wide circular driveway, and sprinted through the heavy front double doors. The house was a chaotic mess. Open designer luggage was scattered across the marble floor of the grand foyer. Kendra was frantically stuffing expensive silk blouses and diamond jewelry into a large leather suitcase. She looked up when the door slammed shut, her face pale and covered in a sheen of nervous sweat. "Did you get the money?" she demanded, her voice shaking with desperate anticipation. "Tell me you got the $3 million. We have a flight to the Cayman Islands, leaving in exactly 4 hours." Jason stood in the doorway, breathing heavily. He pulled the useless broken hard drive from his pocket and threw it onto the marble floor. It skittered across the polished stone and slammed against Kendra's suitcase. "There is no money," he said, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "The entire thing was a setup, Kendra. Rebecca knew we were coming. She built a fake digital server environment to track me. She recorded me downloading garbage files, and she infected the buyer's computer with a federal tracking beacon. They know exactly what I did." Kendra stared at the broken piece of metal on the floor, her eyes wide with absolute horror. She dropped the silk blouse she was holding, her manicured hands trembling uncontrollably. "What do you mean there is no money?" she shrieked, her voice echoing loudly in the high-ceilinged foyer. "You told me this was a foolproof plan, Jason. You told me you knew the system architecture. You told me we were going to be completely safe from her corporate audit." "I was wrong," Jason yelled back, stepping closer. "She outsmarted me, all right. She has access logs, security camera footage, and a digital confession on my phone. We are completely out of time, Kendra. The closing meeting is at 5 o'clock tonight, and she is going to have federal agents waiting to arrest me. I need you to help me destroy the hard drives in my home office right now. We have to wipe everything before they serve the warrants." Kendra took a massive step backward, shaking her head violently. "No," she whispered, backing away from her open luggage. "No, I am not helping you destroy federal evidence. I am not going down for corporate espionage. I only agreed to go along with this because you promised me untraceable cash. You committed a felony all by yourself, Jason. You walked into that building and plugged in that drive. I was sitting right here in this house the entire time. I am not taking the fall for your stupidity." Jason's face contorted into an ugly mask of pure resentment and panic. "You are not taking the fall," he growled, stepping toward her menacingly. "You are the only reason I did this in the first place, Kendra. I only broke into that server room because you embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from my company to buy your stupid designer bags and your luxury cars. If you had not completely drained the operational budget, we would never be in this mess. You are the financial officer. You signed the fraudulent tax returns. I am going to tell the federal prosecutors that you manipulated the books and forced me to sell company assets just to cover your massive tracks. I will testify against you, Kendra. I will throw you right under the bus to save myself. Kendra glared at him, her fear suddenly replaced by a cold, calculating hatred. You really think they will believe you? She sneered, crossing her arms tightly. You are the failed chief executive officer. You are the one caught on camera stealing data. You think you can throw me under the bus, Jason? I have copies of every single financial document. I have audio recordings of you specifically ordering me to misclassify those funds to keep the venture capitalists off your back. I recorded you, Jason. If you try to blame this on me, I will hand those recordings straight to Rebecca and the federal authorities myself. I will make a deal to testify against you so fast it will make your head spin. You are a complete failure of a man, and I am absolutely done with you. The toxic marriage they had built on a foundation of greed and lies instantly shattered into a million jagged pieces as they desperately turned on each other, trying to survive the inevitable destruction. But narcissists possess a terrifying ability to completely rewrite reality when their survival depends on it. By Friday morning, Jason had managed to convince himself and Kendra that the digital trap he triggered was just a localized firewall error on the buyer's laptop. He desperately spun a new web of lies, claiming he had successfully backed up the real hospital source code to a hidden cloud server before the tracking beacon deployed. He promised Kendra that they did not need the rival executive anyway, because they could simply extort the money directly from me. He assured her that I was completely unaware of his midnight infiltration and that I would happily pay millions to keep the corporate data secure. At exactly 5 o'clock that evening, the heavy glass doors of the Aegis Cyber executive boardroom swung open. I was sitting at the head of the long, polished mahogany table with David standing quietly by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. Jason strolled into the room wearing his most expensive tailored suit, projecting the absolute confidence of a conquering king. Kendra walked closely beside him, carrying a designer leather briefcase, her chin held high in a pathetic display of fabricated solidarity. My parents, Richard and Susan, followed right behind them, taking their seats at the opposite end of the table. They all looked incredibly smug, completely convinced that the power dynamic was about to shift entirely in their favor. I folded my hands on top of the smooth table and looked at my brother. The final transition documents are prepared, Jason, I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat. You just need to sign the bottom of the last 3 pages to complete the asset liquidation and formally close the Summit Tech corporate entity. Jason did not even look at the stack of legal papers resting in front of him. He leaned back in his plush leather executive chair, crossing his arms over his chest, with a wide, arrogant smile. I am not signing anything today, Rebecca, he announced, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet boardroom. In fact, the terms of this little acquisition have drastically changed over the last 48 hours. You thought you were so clever buying up my corporate debt, but you completely overlooked the most valuable asset in the entire building. My father, Richard, nodded enthusiastically, leaning forward to rest his elbows on the table. Tell her, Jason, my father urged proudly. Show her that she cannot just steal from her own family without paying the price. Jason leaned forward, mirroring my father's aggressive posture. Last night I paid a little visit to the downtown office, Jason said, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. I bypassed your pathetic security team and downloaded the entire proprietary source code for the 3 regional hospital networks. Every single encrypted patient record and custom firewall architecture is currently sitting on a secure hidden server that only I control. You might own the empty desks and the used computer monitors, but I hold the absolute lifeblood of the company. Kendra smiled coldly, opening her designer briefcase and pulling out a blank sheet of paper. She slid it across the mahogany table toward me. We are willing to make this a very clean and quiet transaction, Kendra stated, her voice dripping with pure extortion. We know those hospital contracts are worth tens of millions of dollars to your firm. Jason will permanently delete his hidden copy of the data and sign your final closing documents right now. But in exchange, you are going to wire exactly $5 million into our offshore account as a mandatory consulting fee. My mother Susan let out a soft, satisfied sigh. It is the only fair way to settle this ugly business, my mother chimed in, adjusting her pearl necklace. You tried to ruin your brother, but he outsmarted you. Just pay him the money, Rebecca, so we can all move on with our lives. My father slammed his hand flat against the table, demanding immediate obedience. You are going to pay him the $5 million right now. Rebecca, my father barked, his face turning red with aggressive authority. If those hospitals find out that their patient data is currently completely unsecure, your entire career in cybersecurity will be permanently destroyed. You will lose every single federal contract you have ever secured. You tried to play a ruthless corporate game, and you lost to a superior mind. Sign the transfer authorization and pay your brother what he rightfully deserves, so he can go salvage his own future. I merely smiled back. I did not reach for my company checkbook. I did not instruct David to draft a $5 million wire transfer to your hidden offshore account. Instead, I calmly reached down beside my leather chair and picked up my heavy briefcase. I set it on the polished mahogany table with a resounding thud that completely shattered the arrogant silence in the boardroom. You really thought you could walk in here and extort me, Jason? I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low. You genuinely believe that you possess the leverage to make me pay for my own proprietary assets? Jason scoffed, crossing his arms tighter. It is not extortion, Rebecca. It is a mandatory consulting fee. You are going to pay it, or you are going to lose everything you have ever worked for. I unclasped the brass locks on my briefcase. I did not pull out a lucrative settlement agreement. I pulled out 3 thick manila folders. I placed the first folder on the table and pushed it firmly across the smooth wood until it stopped right in front of Kendra. Let us start with your massive leverage, I said, looking directly at my extremely confident sister-in-law. Go ahead and open it, Kendra. Tell the entire table what it says. Kendra looked at the folder suspiciously. She slowly uncrossed her arms and flipped open the heavy cover. Her eyes scanned the first page, and all the color instantly drained from her perfectly made-up face. Her hands began to shake violently, causing her diamond bracelets to rattle against the table. Since you seem to have completely lost your voice, I will read it for you. I continued, perfectly calm. That is an official draft indictment from the Securities and Exchange Commission. It details your massive history of corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and tax evasion. It includes every single forged receipt and every illegal transfer you made to fund your luxury lifestyle while your employees went unpaid. It also includes the specific routing numbers for that offshore account you just mentioned a few minutes ago. The federal government has already frozen that account, Kendra. There is absolutely no money left for you to run away with. My mother let out a sharp, confused gasp. Embezzlement, she whispered, looking at Kendra with wide eyes. What is she talking about? Kendra could not answer. She was completely paralyzed, staring at the federal document in absolute horror as her entire fake reality crumbled. I pulled the second thick manila folder from my briefcase and slid it directly across the table to Jason. He glared at me, refusing to touch the heavy envelope. Open it, Jason, I commanded, my voice echoing sharply off the glass walls. Open it and see exactly what kind of leverage you actually hold in this negotiation. Jason hesitated, but his sheer arrogance forced him to reach out. He opened the folder with a trembling hand. The very first page was a high-resolution photograph of the red Aegis cyber warning screen he had seen in the parking garage. That is a complete cybercrime dossier, prepared specifically for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, I explained, watching his smug smirk vanish into thin air. When you broke into my building at 2 o'clock this morning, you did not download the hospital source code. You downloaded gigabytes of randomly generated junk data from an isolated digital sandbox we built specifically to trap you. The files you stole contained a highly sophisticated tracking beacon. We know you tried to sell that fake data to Bradley in a downtown parking garage. We have the security camera footage of your vehicle, and we have the digital logs of his infected laptop." Jason's chest heaved as absolute panic finally set in. He looked at our father, desperate for a defense, but my father was staring at the folder in stunned silence. "You cannot prove I knew it was stolen data." Jason stammered, his voice cracking under the intense pressure. "It was just a misunderstanding. I was just doing a routine backup of my own servers before the final transition." I smiled again, pulling the third and final folder from my briefcase. I tossed it gently onto the center of the mahogany table. It landed with a heavy slap. "That brings us to the third folder," I said, leaning forward and resting my arms on the table. "This is a printed transcript of every single text message you sent me from the server room last night. You specifically detailed your plan to sell the stolen proprietary data to a competitor for untraceable cash. You openly bragged about destroying my reputation and fleeing the country. You provided a complete written confession of your malicious intent. There is no escape from your absolute ruin." The silence in the room was absolute. Kendra stared at the printed text messages and the federal dossier. The illusion of safety she had desperately clung to all morning completely evaporated. She looked over at Jason. He was frozen in his chair with his mouth hanging open and his eyes darting frantically around the room as if looking for a hidden exit. He had promised her an escape. He had promised her a beach in the Cayman Islands and millions of dollars in untraceable cash. Instead, he had delivered her directly into the hands of federal prosecutors. The survival instinct of a cornered animal is a terrifying thing to witness. Kendra did not cry. She did not scream or throw a tantrum like she had on Christmas night. A cold, calculating emptiness washed over her face. She slowly reached down and unzipped the main compartment of her designer leather briefcase. "What are you doing?" Jason whispered, his voice trembling with fear. "Do not say anything, Kendra. We need to call our lawyers." Kendra ignored him completely. She reached inside the briefcase and pulled out a small silver flash drive. She placed it deliberately on the polished mahogany table right next to the draft indictment. She pushed the drive slightly forward toward my side of the table. I looked down at the small piece of metal and then back up at my sister-in-law. "That drive contains over 40 hours of high-quality audio recordings," Kendra stated, her voice dead flat and devoid of any emotion. "I started recording our closed-door financial meetings 6 months ago, when the venture capital money started running dry. Jason ordered me to alter the quarterly expense reports. He explicitly told me to hide his massive personal expenditures under the cloud server maintenance categories to keep the investors happy. He threatened to fire me and leave me with absolutely nothing if I did not cook the corporate books exactly the way he wanted." "You lying witch!" Jason screamed, his face turning a violent shade of purple. "I never forced you to do anything. You spent that money on yourself. You bought those cars and those bags. I have his exact voice on tape giving the direct orders," Kendra continued. She kept her eyes locked on mine, completely ignoring her husband. "I will give you the completely unencrypted drive right now, Rebecca. I will sign a sworn affidavit admitting to my role in the financial mismanagement, but clearly establishing Jason as the primary mastermind of the entire embezzlement scheme. I will testify against him in federal court. I will give the prosecutors everything they need to lock him away for a decade. All I want in exchange is for you to put in a good word with the federal investigators and support my plea deal for complete leniency." The sheer magnitude of her absolute betrayal sent a massive shockwave through the room. My mother, Susan, let out a horrifying wail of pure agony. She pressed her hands against her face, sobbing hysterically as she watched her perfect daughter-in-law coldly sell her golden son to the federal government just to save her own skin. "My father!" Richard stood up from his chair, shaking with uncontrollable rage. "You ungrateful, treacherous snake!" my father roared, pointing a trembling finger at Kendra. "He gave you everything you have. He gave you a beautiful life." Jason completely lost what was left of his mind. The realization that he was going to prison and that his own wife was holding the nails to seal his coffin pushed him right over the edge. With a furious primal roar, he shoved his heavy leather chair backward. He lunged across the wide mahogany table, completely ignoring the federal documents scattered across the wood. He reached out with both hands, aiming directly for Kendra's throat. Kendra shrieked in terror and threw her arms up to protect her face. But Jason never even made it halfway across the table. David moved with terrifying speed. My lead security architect stepped forward, grabbing Jason by the back of his expensive suit jacket and his right shoulder. David yanked my brother backward, pulling him completely off the table and slamming him hard onto the floor. Two additional Aegis cybersecurity officers immediately rushed into the boardroom from the hallway, pinning Jason face down against the ground. Jason thrashed wildly against their heavy grips, screaming profanities at Kendra, who had backed herself into the corner of the room, clutching her briefcase to her chest. The polished corporate environment had completely devolved into a chaotic, desperate crime scene. I watched the violent struggle from my seat, feeling absolutely nothing but cold satisfaction as the golden child finally met his absolute ruin. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom suddenly swung wide open. The loud noise instantly froze the violent chaos unfolding on the floor. 3 men and 1 woman dressed in dark tailored suits and wearing official federal badges clipped to their belts stepped into the room. They had been waiting quietly in David's adjacent office for the past 30 minutes, listening to the entire disastrous meeting through the internal audio feed. They did not look surprised by the chaotic scene. They moved with absolute practiced authority. Federal agents stepped back. The lead agent commanded, his voice projecting a deep, uncompromising authority that made the room instantly drop in temperature. He looked directly at my security team. "We will take it from here right now." David immediately nodded, signaling his officers to step away. Jason lay gasping on the expensive corporate carpet, his tailored suit completely ruined and his tie ripped. He tried to push himself up onto his knees, but 2 federal agents quickly grabbed his arms, pulling him forcefully to his feet. Before Jason could even catch his breath or shout another curse, the harsh metallic click of steel handcuffs echoed loudly through the silent boardroom, securing his wrists tightly behind his back. "Jason, you are under arrest for criminal corporate espionage, federal trade secret theft, and unauthorized access to a protected digital network," the lead agent stated calmly, reading him his rights while firmly holding his shoulder. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The sound of the Miranda rights being read aloud finally shattered the massive delusion my parents had been desperately clinging to. My mother, Susan, let out a sound that I had never heard a human being make before. It was a high-pitched, agonizing shriek of pure maternal horror. She collapsed directly onto the floor, clutching at her chest and sobbing hysterically. Her perfect makeup ran down her face in dark streaks as she crawled blindly toward the federal agents, begging them to let her golden boy go. She pleaded with them, claiming there had to be a terrible mistake and that her son was an important corporate executive who would never commit a crime. The agents ignored her completely, stepping around her flailing arms with practiced indifference. My father, Richard, could not process the sight of his wife weeping on the floor and his son in handcuffs. He turned his desperate fury toward me. He slammed his fists down on the mahogany table, leaning across it with his face twisted in absolute rage. "Stop them right now, Rebecca!" My father roared, his voice cracking with panic. "Tell them to let him go. Tell them you are dropping the charges and that this was all just a massive family misunderstanding. You are the chief executive officer of this company, so you can call them off right now. Tell them it was a corporate drill. Do something to fix this before you ruin his entire life." I remained perfectly seated in my leather chair. I did not flinch or break eye contact with my father. "You are still completely delusional, Richard," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly even and absolutely cold. "I do not control the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I do not dictate policy to the United States Department of Justice. I cannot simply call off federal agents like they are my personal security guards. Jason committed massive felonies and he documented his own crimes. I simply handed the government a neatly wrapped package of undeniable evidence. He ruined his own life the moment he decided to break into my building. I am just the person who finally locked the door behind him. My father stood completely frozen, his mouth opening and closing silently as the absolute finality of my words finally hit him. There was no trust fund left to threaten me with. There were no country club connections that could bribe a federal prosecutor. He was entirely powerless. "Take him out," the lead agent ordered, gesturing toward the heavy glass doors. Jason did not fight back anymore. The fight had been completely drained from him, leaving only a hollow, terrified shell. He looked at me one last time, his eyes wide and completely empty before the agents forcefully turned him around. They marched him out of the boardroom and dragged him straight through the main corporate lobby. Dozens of my new employees stood by their desks watching in absolute silence as the arrogant man who used to terrorize them was paraded through the office in steel handcuffs. He kept his head lowered, staring blankly at his polished, expensive shoes, unable to meet any gaze. The brilliant illusion of his endless superiority had finally shattered into absolute worthless pieces. The golden child was gone forever. The heavy glass doors swung shut, cutting off the sound of the federal agents and leaving a suffocating silence in the executive boardroom. Kendra did not waste a single second mourning the arrest of her husband. Seeing Jason dragged away in handcuffs, she snatched her designer briefcase off the floor, clutching the silver flash drive that was her only ticket to a federal plea deal. She did not even look at my parents. She scrambled out of the room, sprinting toward the emergency stairwell, leaving the family she had married into completely behind. The sound of her expensive heels clicking frantically against the concrete stairs faded away, leaving only my mother and father. My mother, Susan, was still a crumpled, sobbing mess on the expensive corporate carpet. She was hyperventilating, clutching her chest as if her heart had physically shattered. My father, Richard, stood paralyzed beside the mahogany table, his face completely pale and his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sheer terror. I did not offer my mother a hand to help her up. I did not offer my father a glass of water to calm his nerves. I simply sat back down in my leather executive chair and opened my briefcase one final time. I reached inside and pulled out a single sheet of heavy legal paper. It was not a corporate contract or a federal indictment. It was a standard real estate document. I slid it across the smooth wood until it rested right where Jason had been sitting just a few minutes ago. "Richard," I said, breaking the heavy silence with a voice as cold as ice, "I suggest you help your crying wife off the floor and pay very close attention to me, because this is the absolute last time we are ever going to speak." My father blinked slowly, tearing his gaze away from the empty hallway to look down at the legal paper. "What is this?" he asked, his voice completely hollowed out, stripped of all the unearned arrogance he had carried for decades. "That is a formal 30-day eviction notice," I stated, keeping my posture perfectly straight. "You and Mother decided to launch a vicious public smear campaign against me this week. You went to your wealthy country club friends and the local media trying to completely destroy my professional reputation. You came into my home and tried to blackmail me with a family trust fund that did not even exist. You demanded I hand over a multi-million-dollar cybersecurity company to a man who was actively committing federal crimes. You honestly thought you could bully and intimidate the landlord of the very roof over your heads. You have lived in my historic estate rent-free for 3 years." I continued, leaning forward to ensure he heard every single word. "I protected you from the absolute humiliation of public bankruptcy because despite all your terrible parenting, I still felt a tiny shred of moral obligation to the people who raised me. But that obligation died permanently the moment you tried to sacrifice my life and my career just to save him. By the 1st of next month, I want you completely out of my house. If you leave a single piece of furniture or a single broken dish behind, I will have my property management team throw it directly into a dumpster, and I will bill you for the disposal fees." My mother let out another agonizing wail, weakly grabbing the edge of the table to pull herself up from the floor. "You cannot do this to us," she cried, her face streaked with ruined makeup and tears. "Where will we go? We do not have the money to buy a new house. All of our friends are in this neighborhood. You are going to need a lot more than a new house, Susan." I replied coldly, ignoring her pathetic tears. Federal criminal defense attorneys require massive cash retainers, and federal judges set incredibly high bail for flight risks who try to sell corporate secrets to foreign competitors. Jason is facing 10 to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. You are going to have to completely liquidate your precious retirement accounts just to keep him out of a maximum security cell before his trial even begins. I watched the devastating reality of my words sink into their minds. You are going to lose your country club memberships, your luxury leased cars, and every single shred of your fake high society status, I told them. When your wealthy friends read the news tomorrow morning about your bankrupt son committing corporate espionage, they will drop you instantly. You will spend the rest of your lives renting a tiny apartment, spending every dime you have left, trying to visit your golden boy through a pane of thick, bulletproof glass. I stood up from my chair and slowly buttoned my blazer. We are officially done. Do not call my phone. Do not show up at my office. Do not ever try to contact me again. You chose your son, and now you get to share his exact fate. I turned my back on them and walked out of the boardroom, leaving them completely alone in the absolute ruins of their own making. I left them in that boardroom and never looked back. The immediate weeks that followed were a whirlwind of intense corporate restructuring and absolute silence from the people who used to call themselves my family. Exactly 2 months later, that heavy silence was replaced by the low, pleasant hum of a private aviation terminal at the international airport. I stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows of the exclusive VIP lounge, holding a flute of chilled champagne. The morning sun cast a warm golden glow across the pristine tarmac, but my attention was momentarily drawn to the large flat-screen television mounted above the mahogany bar. The local news anchor was delivering the top story of the hour. A bright graphic flashed on the screen showing the Summit Tech logo shattered into pieces right next to a terrible courtroom sketch of my older brother. The anchor announced the final sentencing of Jason, who had just been handed a massive 15-year sentence in a federal penitentiary for criminal corporate espionage and severe trade secret theft. The broadcast detailed how his legal defense completely collapsed when his own wife Kendra accepted a federal plea deal. She handed over her hidden audio recordings in exchange for 3 years of strict probation and absolute financial ruin. The reporter also briefly mentioned the tragic social downfall of his parents, who had recently declared total bankruptcy after liquidating their retirement accounts and selling off their luxury vehicles just to pay for his massive legal fees. I watched the screen intently as they showed a brief clip of Jason being escorted out of the federal courthouse. He was wearing a bright orange jumpsuit, his wrists shackled to a thick, heavy chain wrapped around his waist. He looked incredibly old, completely stripped of the arrogant golden glow he had worn his entire life. My parents were captured in the background of the raw footage, pushing through a crowd of aggressive reporters with their heads hung low, completely broken and utterly humiliated. I stared at the broadcast, waiting to feel a twinge of guilt or a sudden rush of familial pity. But my chest was completely empty. I felt absolutely nothing but the peaceful quiet of a permanently closed chapter. I set my empty champagne glass onto the smooth marble bar, turned my back on the television screen, and walked out of the lounge toward the open boarding doors. The warm summer breeze hit my face as I stepped out onto the private tarmac. Sitting at the bottom of the aircraft stairs, resting both hands elegantly on the silver handle of her wooden cane, was Grandma Ruth. She wore a tailored beige trench coat and a wide-brimmed sun hat, looking absolutely radiant. The sleek white private jet waited directly behind her with the powerful engines humming softly in preparation for takeoff. We were heading to Paris for a month-long vacation fully paid for by the massive surge in Aegis cyberstock, following our highly successful integration of the regional hospital networks. Grandma Ruth looked up as I approached, her sharp eyes scanning my face to make sure I was not carrying any lingering guilt. "Are you ready to go?" she asked, her voice strong and steady. I smiled, linking my arm gently through hers to help her up the steep metal stairs. "I have never been more ready in my entire life," I replied. She patted my hand affectionately as we stepped into the luxurious cabin of the jet. "Leave the heavy baggage on the ground, Rebecca," she told me, settling into her plush leather seat. "You have carried their dead weight for far too long." As the jet taxied down the private runway, I looked out the oval window and let my mind completely settle. For my entire life, I had been conditioned to believe that family loyalty was an unconditional absolute. I was taught that blood required endless sacrifice, and that setting personal boundaries was an act of pure selfishness. But the brutal reality is that toxic people will use that exact conditioning to bleed you completely dry. They will demand your money, your peace of mind, and your entire future while calling it a moral obligation. Breaking that vicious cycle requires an incredible amount of ruthless strength. It requires you to look the people who raised you right in the eye and tell them that your survival is no longer up for negotiation. I did not destroy Jason. I did not destroy my parents. I simply stopped being their absolute safety net and allowed gravity to finally do its job. When you stop catching people who intentionally jump off cliffs, they eventually hit the ground. I leaned back into my comfortable seat, feeling the powerful thrust of the jet engines as we lifted off the runway and soared into the clear blue sky. I was no longer the angry little sister fighting for scraps of validation. I was the sole owner of a massive tech empire, and the undisputed master of my own peaceful reality. I realized then that you never actually have to lower yourself to fight your abusers in the dirt. The absolute greatest revenge you can ever achieve is massive unbothered success.